The different planes and the different axes in anatomy can be confusing because they have the same names, but they serve entirely different purposes. So if you find that you're easily confused by this concept, then this video is definitely for you. So let's start with the planes. So we have the sagittal plane. So the way I remember that sagittal cuts the body in half is sagittal, I think of the word tail. And if you had a tail and that tail is splitting your body, and if you cut that tail in half, that tail is splitting your body in right and left. So that's basically how I think of the sagittal plane. I know it's kind of weird, but that's the best way I could remember it, and it's never failed since then. Okay, the coronal plane splits your body in half anteriorly and posteriorly, as you can see in this case, right here. The way I think of it is coronal, you think of the head, you think of the crown, you think of the face. So coronal splits your body where one half is your face and the other is the back of your head. And then transverse plane, T stands for top and bottom. So transverse splits the body into the top half, T for top, and the bottom. And that's how I remember the three planes. Sagittal is the same as longitudinal, and the way I remember it is tail for sagittal, and then you can have a long tail. So those words are the same. Parasagittal splits the body up in the same way as sagittal by right or left, but it doesn't do it equally. It splits half of the left side or it splits half of the right side. So you're splitting up the body by 1/4 and 3/4. Coronal means the same as frontal, and that's easier to remember because you're splitting the body up front and back. Transverse is top and bottom. And the way I remember axial, I'm sure there are better ways to remember it, but if you're going to split the body up by an axe, it's easier to do it via transverse than coronal or sagittal. So that's how I think about it, and I've never forgotten it because it's pretty stupid, but I've never forgotten it. And oblique is basically splitting up the body in any other type of plane. So when you think of plane, you visualize rectangles splitting the body. The axis is totally different. The axis is splitting up the body with rods or with poles, basically, by visualizing rods or poles. So we have three axes. And if you envision placing a ring around this pole or rod, the movement the ring would make around that rod is the movement a joint would make around an axis. So here we have three different types of axes. The problem is it's a sagittal axis. We just learned about the sagittal plane. We just learned about the frontal plane or the longitudinal plane and the transverse plane. Movements along the sagittal, transverse, frontal, or longitudinal plane are very different when it comes to movements around a sagittal axis or a transverse axis. The movements are not the same. That's where it gets confusing. So I'm here to clear that up today. So let's start with number one, the sagittal axis. So the way we remembered sagittal in the last slide was tail. So envision a tail on this guy. That tail is moving in the same direction as this rod, this sagittal rod, and that's how you remember the sagittal axis, like a tail. Anterior-posterior is another word for sagittal, and that is also easier to remember because this rod is moving from the anterior body to the posterior body. So when you have a ring and you put that around this rod, it's moving in this direction. Imagine a ring. So the only way, if a hand was going to move along the sagittal axis, it could only move sideways. So that's why you have abduction and adduction along the sagittal axis. The second axis is a transverse frontal or medial lateral axis. So in the last slide, we learned that transverse split the body from the top to the bottom. But the way I remember that is that it moves from the medial to the lateral. The way that it's cut, the rod, is if I were, last time we used the analogy of an axe because the transverse and the axial plane are the same. If someone had an axe, it'd be easier to cut it in this direction if you wanted to split the body up in top to bottom. It's very violent. That's just how I remember the transverse axis. The frontal axis, it's easy to remember frontal because it splits the body up from the front. The rod splits the body up from the front, from the posterior body to the anterior body. So it's a little easier to remember the frontal axis. And medial lateral is the easiest to remember because the rod runs from the medial side to the lateral side of the body, basically. Now, if I put a ring around this pole, the movement would be in this direction. So the limbs would move forward or backward. They would swing in this direction along this axis. And that is flexion and extension. And then the last axis is vertical or longitudinal. So when you think of the word long, this is the longest axis because it's on the whole body. And once again, vertical is easier to remember. If you put a ring along this, you're moving your body, you're rotating the body internally or medially. And that's easy to remember. So planes are very different from axes, but if you remember it in the way that I just mentioned, then it's not that hard to differentiate between the two. So this is the axis once again. I just wanted to have my citation up so you can figure out where to get the photo. So now we'll discuss flexion and extension in relation to both the axis and the plane. So when you flex or extend, always remember front and back. 99.9% of the time, flexion is front and back. F flexion for front. The way flexion and extension differ is flexion decreases the joint. So when you do a bicep curl, you're decreasing the angle of the joint. Or when you move the heel of your foot towards your butt, you're decreasing the angle of the joint. While extension is the opposite. Extension is increasing the angle of the joint. And flexion is decreasing it in this case, and extension is moving it back. So when you think of flexion, you're moving your body forward and back. So the axis for flexion and extension, like we discussed, is the transverse axis, or the horizontal axis, or the medial-lateral axis. But the plane is actually the sagittal axis because it's splitting the body in half. Because you're moving along so if you put a rectangle on half of the body, where right to left are equal, you're moving forward and back. That plane is the sagittal plane. Okay, so for abduction and adduction is always sideways. When I think of the term abduction, I think of an alien abduction. You're taking someone away, you're taking something away. So it goes away, farther away. Adduction, I think of addition, you're adding something, so it moves closer. But it's all moving sideways. So when you think of this rotation, the axis is sagittal. It's a sagittal axis, or the anterior-posterior axis. But when you think of the plane, if you put a rectangle through this form of movement that I'm making right now with my laser pointer, that is the coronal or the frontal plane. Does that make sense? Okay, so we just went over the flexion and extension, the axis and the plane. And then we also did the same for adduction and abduction. And the exception is the thumb. So the thumb does the opposite. So the thumb it flexes and extends on the frontal plane, while the thumb adducts and abducts on the sagittal plane. So it's the opposite. So you just switch the two, basically, when it comes to the thumb. So for internal and external rotation, you do that along the vertical and longitudinal axis, like in that prior picture, and the rotation occurs along the transverse or horizontal plane. Okay, so now we have a review. So I'm just going to ask you questions related to everything because it can be complicated. So this is just a short little quiz. So when I read the concept out loud, just pause it and answer, and then unpause, and I will recite the answer. So the plane that splits left and right, that is the sagittal plane. Transverse plane splits. The transverse plane splits the body into the top half and the bottom half. The plane that runs along a laceration that runs from the left shoulder to the left wrist, that is a coronal or frontal plane. The axis where flexion and extension occur, that is the transverse plane, or sorry, the transverse axis, or the mediolateral axis, or the horizontal axis. They all mean the same thing. The axis where internal rotation occurs, that is the longitudinal or vertical axis. The direction of the transverse axis, that is the mediolateral axis. So it's a rod that cuts from the left hip to the right hip. And that is the end of the review. I hope this video was helpful to you. Thank you.